Fasting and praying are powerful spiritual disciplines that engage us not only internally but also externally. In the story of Moses and the Amalekites, we see how physical obedience can bring about spiritual release. When Moses obeyed God's command to lift his hands toward heaven while the battle was taking place, it had a direct impact on the unseen world. As long as Moses maintained physical obedience by keeping his hands raised, the Israelites were winning the battle. This physical act of obedience resulted in the release of angels into the situation to fight on behalf of God's people. The importance of physical obedience in spiritual matters is highlighted in the story. It demonstrates that our actions in the physical realm have a corresponding effect in the spiritual realm. When we align our physical actions with God's commands, we activate spiritual forces and bring about His purposes on earth. Unfortunately, in the modern church, there is often a tendency to focus solely on internal feelings and intellect, neglecting the importance of physical expressions of faith. We may think that as long as we feel humble, loving, or faithful internally, we don't need to demonstrate it outwardly. However, physical obedience, such as bowing, clapping, raising hands, or even fasting, plays a significant role in our spiritual lives and the manifestation of God's power. Therefore, let us not underestimate the power of physical obedience in our spiritual walk. By aligning our actions with God's commands, we invite His presence and power to work in and through us, bringing about victory in our lives and circumstances. This passage emphasizes the importance of physical obedience in spiritual matters, drawing parallels between actions in the physical realm and the release of spiritual power. Just as Moses' physical act of raising his hands resulted in victory for the Israelites, physical obedience such as fasting can release God's supernatural power and blessings. Fasting is presented as one of these acts of physical obedience that can lead to spiritual breakthroughs and the release of God's power. By abstaining from food and devoting oneself to prayer and seeking God, individuals open themselves up to receive divine favor, help, protection, healing, miracles, and blessings. The analogy of expressing love to a spouse highlights the concept that merely internalizing faith or intentions is insufficient. God may require physical actions as demonstrations of obedience and commitment, and fasting is presented as one such act with a direct connection to spiritual outcomes. Overall, this passage underscores the idea that physical obedience, such as fasting, is instrumental in accessing spiritual rewards and experiencing the fullness of God's power and blessings in one's life. This passage emphasizes the idea that as one progresses in their spiritual journey and embraces higher levels of calling and assignment from God, they can expect greater divine protection and assistance. The saying, "higher levels, higher devils," acknowledges that spiritual warfare intensifies as one's spiritual maturity and influence grow, but it should not deter believers from pursuing God's calling on their lives. The analogy of the battlefield illustrates the concept that those with greater responsibilities and assignments from God receive higher levels of divine protection. Just as a 5-star general would have more soldiers protecting them than a private, individuals entrusted with significant spiritual tasks can expect increased angelic protection and participation in their assignments. The story of Elijah and his servant, who witnessed angelic forces surrounding them, further reinforces the idea that God provides ample protection for those serving Him faithfully, especially in the face of daunting challenges or opposition. The passage encourages believers not to shrink back from pursuing God's purposes due to fear of increased spiritual warfare. Instead, they are urged to embrace their calling boldly, trusting in God's provision of divine protection and assistance. The example of Daniel's fasting and prayer leading to a divine encounter highlights the power of spiritual disciplines in connecting believers with God's supernatural provision and guidance. In the passage from Daniel chapter 10, Daniel describes his fast where he abstained from pleasant or desirable food for 3 weeks. During this time of fasting and prayer, he has a supernatural encounter with an angel who addresses him as greatly beloved. This encounter highlights Daniel's special favor with God. The term greatly beloved signifies Daniel's high standing and favor in the eyes of God. It emphasizes the deep affection and regard that God has for Daniel. The angel's words affirm Daniel's significance and importance to God. The distinction between God's love and favor is also emphasized in the passage. While God's love is constant, unconditional, and available to all, favor is described as a specific blessing or divine assistance that is given as a gift. It is not something that can be earned or deserved but is freely given by God according to His will and purposes. Daniel's fasting and prayer demonstrated his commitment to seeking God's presence and guidance, which resulted in him receiving favor and divine revelation. This passage underscores the importance of spiritual disciplines like fasting and prayer in cultivating a closer relationship with God and receiving his favor and blessings. The passage emphasizes the distinction between God's unconditional love, which is freely given to all, and his favor, which is bestowed in response to certain actions or attitudes. While God's love is constant and unwavering, the increase of his favor in our lives is often linked to our obedience and sacrifice. Daniel's story exemplifies how obedience, sacrifice, and seeking God's presence can lead to an unusual increase of favor. Despite facing opposition from spiritual forces, Daniel's commitment to fasting and prayer ultimately resulted in the intervention of the Archangel Michael, leading to breakthrough and victory. The narrative also highlights the spiritual realm and the existence of angelic beings engaged in warfare. While there is no direct battle between God and Satan, spiritual forces may oppose the fulfillment of God's purposes, requiring believers to engage in spiritual warfare through prayer, obedience, and reliance on God's power. The passage underscores the importance of persistence in prayer and fasting, as well as the role of angelic assistance in overcoming spiritual opposition. Ultimately, it points to the sovereignty of God and his ability to intervene on behalf of his people even in the face of formidable challenges. The passage emphasizes the reality of spiritual warfare between angelic and demonic forces and the role of believers in influencing the outcome of this battle through their actions and attitudes. It suggests that believers have a vote in determining the victory of heavenly forces by their obedience, faith, and connection to God through prayer and fasting. Jesus' response to his disciples in Mark 17 regarding their inability to cast out a demon highlights two key factors: unbelief and a perverse generation. Unbelief signifies a disconnection from God, leading to fear, anxiety, and despair. On the other hand, being part of a perverse generation implies being too connected to the world and its values rather than to God. The solution provided by Jesus is prayer and fasting, which serve to reconnect believers to God while disconnecting them from worldly influences. Prayer facilitates a connection to God, while fasting helps to detach from worldly desires and distractions. This reconnection to God and detachment from the world are essential for overcoming spiritual obstacles and participating effectively in spiritual warfare. Ultimately, the passage underscores the importance of maintaining a strong connection to God through prayer and fasting, which empowers believers to overcome spiritual challenges and influence the outcome of spiritual battles. The speaker emphasizes the importance of maintaining spiritual alignment by regularly seeking God's help and acknowledging moments of disconnect from Him. They express gratitude for seasons of honesty and vulnerability where believers recognize their need to disconnect from worldly influences and reconnect with God through fasting and prayer. Fasting is presented as a powerful tool for disconnecting from the world and re-establishing a connection with God. Through fasting, believers can obtain a fresh anointing, dominion over the enemy, and the favor of God in their lives. The speaker encourages listeners to embrace fasting as a means to become more desirable to God, echoing the example of Daniel, who experienced favor and divine intervention through his commitment to fasting and prayer. Overall, the message highlights the transformative power of fasting and prayer in deepening one's relationship with God, overcoming spiritual obstacles, and experiencing His favor and blessing. It encourages believers to embrace fasting as a spiritual discipline that aligns them with God's will and enables them to walk in His power and favor.